I'm Michael Heller, and you are watching the Break It Down Show.
Man, you've got a cool book. I love this thing. It's called Mine. I'm going to imitate my dad now, right? And this is going to go right into what you're doing. Well, as a kid, we had things in the house that, it's the house. It's a community thing. You're a kid.
Yeah.
But my dad had certain things you did not touch. His old time station, stagecoach model, and the calculator that had like a feed on it. And then
I remember those. Yeah.
Yeah, he would look at you and go, "This is mine," and he would yell and he would tap his chest like crazy, and it would freak me out because I'm like, but I'm just curious about numbers and adding, and but your book is sort of about these kind of things like ownership and what it means. You're all over the airwaves, so I don't want to cover everything the same way, but let's talk a little bit about the premise of the book, the Freakonomics kind of aspect of ownership and everything, and what you and your co-author, and his name is James Salzman. Right there, here's the book. I'll put the link up in a second, but let's talk about it.
So what we realized is that people were kind of scared about stuff. It's like you were scared of your dad. People are scared. They think, ownership, that's like law. That's boring. That's hard. That's somebody else's problem. What we realized is that 99.99% of your ownership conflicts that you're in, and you're in them hundreds of times a day, they are all outside of the law. They are something that each of us can get access to. It's like whether you're the front of the line or the back of the line, it's what you drink, it's where you live, it's what you eat, it's what you watch and listen to. Ownership is all around us. So our basic discovery was, hey, this is stuff that we can all get access to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You guys open with a very good example where we have this ownership dilemma, and you talk about airline seats. Now I want to take a moment and describe kind of my flying philosophy. I don't want to get on first. I'm glad to be last. I won't hold anybody up, but I'm not in a rush to wait in line. And so I let everybody get on. I absolutely have a system. I sit left side of the fuselage in a certain number seat because I kind of know the pattern of the windows. And I curl myself into my little corner, put my head in that little divot where that half window is. I have a whole thing. I'll surrender the middle armrest, all in order to not be anybody's problem. And I've already gone to the bathroom, so I probably won't have to get up the whole flight. Yeah. But I will recline my seat right as we are taking off, so that way there's no conflict. When you're worried about taking off and everything's going backwards, I slide back, and that way I'm already back and it's not a problem. That's just sort of how I do it. But let's talk about the ownership of that space and what you guys kind of discovered.
Yeah, like ownership is nothing fancy. Like one of the ownership conflicts we all get into is you get on the airplane and you like, can I lean back? Or you say, listen, I'm trying to work on my laptop or want to watch a movie. And you say, hold it, why is that person leaning their seat into my lap? So that wedge of space is absolutely up for grabs. And you have a strategy, which is lean back, claim the space. I tend to be more a sit up and work on my computer guy. But either way, we both have a really strong story that we're saying. When you sit back, you're saying, hey, that wedge of space, it's attached to my seat. That little button, that controls the wedge. That principle is one of just 6 simple stories that everyone uses to claim everything in the world. It's mine because it's attached to something mine. And I'm saying, get out of my space, buddy. Get out of my space. That space is mine. I possess it with my laptop. I was there first. Possession is 9/10 of the law. First come, first serve. Those are 2 more. We've now covered 3. Attachment, first in time in possession. That little wedge of space, we're fighting over 3 of the 6 ownership stories that everyone worries about, everyone fights about, everyone uses to claim everything in the world. And here's the really important thing about this story. It's the airlines that are creating this conflict between you and me over that space. They're doing it for their profit. They are real masters. All they have to sell is that inch of space. So they're masters of design. What they've done is they've designed it to sell it twice. Once to you to lean back, and that same space for me, for my laptop. And they figure that we're going to be polite and work it out, but that politeness lets them double sell that space.
Yeah, and there's so many great examples of this. Even in the foreword, you do it with that, or maybe it's the first chapter when you talk about the rocking chair, and you think about. So I'll just do the story real quick. A dude dies. His kids fight over the rocking chair to the point of going to court because one of the siblings grabs it, the other one's like, "Well, I'm going to go sue you for it." So now we're spending, I don't know, what would you guess, Michael? Are we spending $500,000 on this process to have the court manage the negotiation of this chair? And then, I mean, like, it's so much money.
Crazy. It's crazy. Like, this is one of my basic lessons for law students. Never go to court. Never go to court. If you go to court, everyone loses. Like, work it out. And 99.99% of all ownership conflicts, people work it out. It's only, I tell my students this, it's like deviants who end up in court, like people who can't work it out. Sometimes you have to. Sometimes it's like, you have to, you can't avoid it. But over your dad's rocking chair, you and your siblings should not be in court. Like, when people pass away in your life, there's like stuff that you want to remember them by, and you shouldn't turn it into a lawsuit. That's like the worst possible choice you can make. Anyway, but that rocking chair, like, who gets it? Like, when you have stuff in your family and you both want it, came from your parents, like, who gets it? There's no answer. The law doesn't tell you who gets it. Like, it's another one of these examples where you have to actually just work it out, and we can choose. The one kid took it first. The other one sued first. You could auction it. There's a lot of different ways you could solve it, and each one of those choices tells you something about you, not about the law, because there is no law. What it tells you is, what do you really value? Do you value time or money, reward or punishment? Like, every ownership battle that we're in reveals like really deep values that we have about who we are as people.
Here in LA, when the Dodgers moved here, they moved into what was going to be a public space. It was going to be a tenement housing back when that was like the answer. And then they're like, forget that. We're going to turn it into like an expo center, maybe a zoo, all these ideas. But the Dodgers came, and then the city's like, no, this is a real win for us. We're going to do that. However, it was occupied by people. And so they made an offer of like $35,000 to anybody who just walks away from their home. You can go buy something down the hill and no problem, except for those 10 to 20 families that didn't go. And so what happens? They ultimately, years and years later, lots of court battles, the sheriff and a bulldozer come up and they just smash people's houses down. I'm not saying right or wrong, but if you just took that and said, let's double the offer, and like, we understand this is your home, this is valuable. But there was this fight over ownership, and it involved moving a bulldozer up onto a mountain, which again costs more than just paying the people out. I mean, there's no way that it's in anybody's best interest to spend all that court money and sheriff, it's just, but that fight had to happen over ownership.
Yeah, it does it all the time. So that's a pretty extreme example. And mostly one of the sort of nice things about America is, like, if it's your home, it's pretty much yours, and no one can, leverage you out of it. So unless you basically agree to sell, it's and sell at your price, you don't have to sell. Now, there are some cases where government can get you out. Like, if they need your house to like build a highway and there's no other path and they've picked it, then they can basically pay you the fair market value. So there's a mechanism, we call it eminent domain or condemnation. It doesn't happen very often. It used to happen more when we were building the highway system. Now it just happens now and then. And when it does happen, often the people who get screwed basically are those who don't have the political power to divert the highway like the next mile over. It goes through their backyards. So one of the things to always do is to be aware, like, these are all choices. Like, whose house gets condemned for the new stadium. Stadium can go here and it can go there. It's a bunch of options. So it's basically usually the community that has the least power that gets the one that gets bulldozed.
Yeah, that's like that whole movie that Ed Norton did with Alec Baldwin about New York. And what was that dude's name? I mean, it's such a powerful story because you have to move forward as New York. You have to have free wish. You have to have a way to move people. You have to build things. And that means you have to target the cheapest land, which is owned by the poorest people, or rented.
Yeah. Well, it's when Robert Moses was building New York City, like, all the big bridges and highways that sort of created modern New York, the Triborough, the Northern State Parkway across Long Island. They had a lot of choices about where those highways were going to go. I don't know if you're not a New Yorker. I live in New York, up by Columbia, where I teach, and it's an absolute mess to get out to Long Island. You have to go all the way up to 125th Street in Harlem, across, and then all the way back down to get out to Queens, to get to Long Island. That whole extra route was because there was a nice neighborhood that was directly across from where we are that Moses didn't want to go through, so we just put it through the poor community of color. And that's always true. It's like, it turns out that these are all choices. There's no magic natural way for like where you put a highway or any ownership choice, whether you lean back or not. It's all a choice that gets determined by a handful of simple rules of ownership.
Yeah, you've got your different designs on what the ownership is. There's, not possession is 9/10. There's also, and I don't know if this is ownership or not, but I think this falls into the category of what you're talking about. When you talk about Chicago versus New York in terms of holding spots in the wintertime,
Yeah.
another thing that happens for sure in any big city is, you don't exclusively own the paint on your bumper because you have to park so tight. And you know this from living in New York. Like
Absolutely.
you're going to push. You're not ramming yourself into a car, but you are trying to get into a tight space.
Well, you basically you bump forward and back until you're more or less in, and that's
because
pretty
we all
familiar
agree we'd
experience.
like that extra space for an extra
Absolutely.
spot,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know? But you get a $50,000 car and you're like, yeah, smash into it all you want. I don't own that space enough.
Well, here's the thing, you shouldn't own
Yeah.
there shouldn't be, free parking on New York City streets at all. That's a super valuable resource, those parking spaces. And the notion that they are basically available to everybody for free is nuts. It means that there's way too many cars in New York City, way too much pollution, way too much congestion. If the city actually priced those parking spaces what they were actually worth, a lot of people would say, you know what, I'll actually take my car out of the city. I don't need to be here. And what's happened during the pandemic is so interesting. Like now, the only way for restaurants to survive is to have restaurants outdoors in the city. So all the parking spaces up and down the avenues where all the restaurants are, they've all turned into tables and chairs for restaurants. The city actually said, here's a more valuable use for that parking space than a handful of cars. We can use that space to keep the restaurant industry alive. And that's just, again, ownership is up for grabs, and the city basically shifted it from free parking for well-off people to restaurant space for the rest of us. It's actually I thought it was very powerful, and it's a good move.
Let me ask you a legal question then. So in Chicago around Wrigley Field, the rooftop owners established businesses, to be able to view the game from their rooftop.
Yeah.
And there's a problem of, hey, you don't have rights to this. You're using it to do it. But the Cubs allowed it for decades. And so there's what I would say, and again, I'm not a lawyer, there's like a tort problem there where the business owner can now say, I built this business model in something that you allowed me to do. Like a kind of implied contract. But how do you settle something like that? Who does own the air between my eyes and the game? If I've got a building,
right? So homeowners around the field say, listen, I've got a great view of the field. Come up, I'll sell you space on my roof, and you can watch the game for free. And that is absolutely the way it should be. Like one of the points that I make to my students, which they are always flipped out about, is law is massively overrated. Solving these problems through law makes no sense. The basic rule for views is you should be able to use it. And one of the really surprising strategies of a lot of the most sophisticated companies, we'll come back to baseball, which is a sophisticated company. One of their really core advanced strategies is what I call in the book tolerated theft. So why does HBO tolerate and even encourage people to illegally steal their passwords? It's the same reason why it's okay for Wrigley Field for you to set up your rooftop tailgating. Yeah, because it's what they're basically doing. HBO on the passwords, but also for Wrigley Field is they're building fans. Like one of the surprising things for Wrigley Field for the Cubs game team is that they actually benefit more by having people pirate the view. How do they do that? They benefit because it builds Cubs fans. Like the last thing you want to do is piss off your best customers, the ones who are willing to go sit on a rooftop for a long distance view. You want them to enjoy the game because eventually they're going to be the fans that are buying bleachers tickets and maybe eventually the more expensive ones. So that strategy of tolerating theft to build a fan base is actually one of the key ownership strategies of the 21st century. Actually, my co-author Jim and I have an article in last week's Harvard Business Review. And it doesn't talk about the Cubs, but it talks about a bunch of companies like the Cubs, HBO, Disney, Netflix, that use tolerated theft to build their businesses.
There's a concept in Sweden where the land is owned by everybody. Your house is different, but if it's public land, which most of it is, someone can walk through your front yard. They could camp in your front yard if it's the right kind of open space.
Yeah.
We don't have that here across the board, but we have elements of that. And you guys talk about land use. Let's get into that a little bit.
It is so cool. People, and when you think about America, the no trespassing version, stay off my land. That's not American history. History of America, when the country was founded until quite recently, people were free to roam across your land, specifically if they were hunting. They couldn't camp there, but if they were hunting across your land, if they were foraging for blueberries or mushrooms, that was all part of their property right. Your right as the landowner did not include the right to keep people out for land that was unposted, uncultivated, just like forest land. If you want to keep people out, you could fence it, you could post it, and then they had to stay out. But in the background rule was, it's free. It's free for people to use it. About half the states have now switched the rule. So in half the states in America, you can't go on to unposted land, and in half the states you still can. And what that shows for me is that again, that's a version of the same simple stories that with airplane seats and the one we've already talked about, which is I'm saying the land is mine because it's the stuff on it, the wild animals on it are attached to my land.
Right.
Same as that button on the airplane seat. And you, the forager, are saying, no, it's my labor. You reap what you sow. I was first to capture that animal or that pick that mushroom. And for most of American history, that labor is what counted. It's only quite recently that the attachment, the keep out possession story, the barbed wire story about ownership, that's a very new understanding of ownership in this country.
If you own land like open space and you have pigeons or pheasant on it or blueberries or whatever it is, mushrooms, but if you create an atmosphere, scrub oak and stuff like that, where dove are going to go, they plant it in your riverbed.
Yeah.
You don't own those dove. You can never produce any document, but they are in sort of yours because they're on your land, and to get access to them, you have to go ask the farmer, and they may say, hey, I charge everybody this, or give me a couple of pheasant. There is a negotiation, but you really don't own these birds.
No one owns them. They're wild animals. It's like, it says they're as free as the air. And that's true for, that's true for oil when it's in the ground, water flowing underground. It's true for the air that you breathe. It's all unowned until you actually do what it takes to make it yours. And what it takes to make it yours is always up for grabs. So for those pheasant, it may well be that it's worth it to you to pay that farmer to get access to that riverbed. And then that's the path in. But the farmer doesn't own them. So that's true. Most of these ownership disputes, that's a pretty specialized one. I haven't shot pheasant, but if you do, that pheasant are free wild animals, and there is no ownership until you actually bag it.
Yeah, but I bet that person owns that land. It's like, yeah, these are my birds. I bet they think of it as theirs.
100%. People get attached to things really easily. That's actually how retailers make a lot of their money. Like the reason that Apple stores have wide open spaces and you can go touch and play with all the stuff is it turns out that they know that as soon as you pick up the iPhone off the table, even when it's not yours, it becomes worth more to you. There's something that psychologists have discovered, something called the Endowment Effect. These two guys, Tversky and Kahneman, won the Nobel Prize for discovering this. That if it's the same item, before you touch it, it's worth one price. And after you're touching it, the same thing, just touch it, it becomes worth more. You're willing to pay more for that same thing as soon as you hold on to it. So that notion of possession is super powerful in people's lives.
That is bananas.
Yeah, and it's how retailers profit from this. They know this. They're like, okay, that's why they want you to test drive the car. You're actually willing to pay for more after you test drive it. That's why Zappos will send you shoes that you can send back. It's like you try them on, you feel like they're yours. Yeah, so it's a real secret for retailers.
There must be an escalating scale of that ownership too, where Zappos is a great example. Like, let's show you a model wearing these shoes, an actual video. They were the first ones to really sell things with models wearing the shoe. And you didn't just get a picture of the tips of the shoe. You got all these different angles and you could move the shoe around, which really is the best form of touching that you can do digitally. It's like, oh yeah, you know what? These things do look pretty nice. And oh, look at that in blue pants. Okay. Yeah.
It's great. It's great as it's the best you can do digitally. And even with that, it turns out we have two systems in our brains. We have a physical touching system, and we have the looking online system, and they don't actually correspond so well. So as good as you can do in person, what Zappos figured out is we're going to send you the shoes. Yeah, and you can try the shoes on. It's that which actually seals. It's that which activates this endowment effect that we discovered.
Yeah, and there must be a number, like when we send out shoes, we get 90% of them out the door and they don't come back. Boomerang effect.
Yeah, absolutely. People get attached, and once they get attached, this very powerful, it's very primitive. This actually goes back, it's one of the first words that kids learn is mine. Mine, you hear in the playground, but it doesn't start there. It goes back to our animal territoriality and our possession, animals' possession over their nesting area. And our shoes actually are a sort of modern version of that.
I want to go back to the leaning on the law more than it's capable of doing. And I love, like, my friends right now who are landlords are like, they haven't collected a check in a year. Like, yeah, because it's a pandemic and people don't necessarily have jobs, and you negotiated a price based on a different reality, you know? And so, like, back when the financial crisis happened in 2008, where squattings in homes, you can call the cops and they can come down to that house. And then the person there's like, I've got a rental agreement. Whether that's true or not, it's irrelevant to the sheriff. They're like, not my problem. You got to take it to court. And then you can win as the landowner, but still lose because you've had to expend thousands of dollars.
Or tens of thousands. It's nuts. It is
You're
nuts.
Right. Yeah. So you can win, but really, no.
Yeah. When you go to court, usually both people lose. But so you're thinking back like in 2008 with the big financial crash, the mortgage crisis.
Yeah.
You know, there were thousands of people who were like squatting, tens of thousands, squatting in homes around the country. And once someone, like, you know, in a lot of the states, you can like repel people from breaking into your house. Like, initially the police will come and defend you. But once they're in, their rights completely change. Yeah. So once they're squatting there, then you need to do a much more complicated process to get them out. And that's been true historically in America for all the way back. A lot of early American sort of real estate law was about protecting squatters. Like, people didn't have good title back in the 1800s. So a lot of American ownership law today for homes traces back to a time when people were settling the West and there were conflicting pieces of paper. And the people who were actually sitting there were able to win more often than you would expect. And those basic old-fashioned sort of Wild West laws still apply today. Now, for landlords today, it's really a mess because we have an eviction moratorium, which is, you know, maybe means you don't necessarily get paid, but you still have to pay your bank. Like, your bank there's no moratorium on the bank collecting from you as a landlord. So I think that actually the real problem with a lot of the eviction moratorium isn't protecting the tenants, is that the moratorium didn't really go far enough and didn't take into account the continuing obligations of landlords. You know, most landlords in this country are, you know, they own one building. Like, this is their retirement account. Right. Retirement. It's not in a 401k. It's in this one, four unit apartment that they're trying to manage. That's it for them. And they have to pay their mortgage even if their tenants aren't paying them. So I think that's a real gap, we missed that when we had all this COVID relief. It's important to protect tenants, absolutely. And it's important to protect the landlords.
Politicians suck at this.
It's so hard to do. It's so hard to do. Yeah.
Then let's pull that back now and let's look at a bigger picture, like a place like Rhodesia versus Zimbabwe. Yeah. You know, two people culturally can't get along, refuse to. They have to go to war. And then in this case, the Zimbabwe side wins and there is no Rhodesia anymore. So now the Rhodesians are scattered to the wind. Yeah. They don't belong to anywhere. They don't own anything. And this is true, like when we talk about like, Indian land. Well, who was the tribe before them and who was the tribe before them? And you can just go on forever. When do you belong to a place? I'm Caucasian. If I went to their Georgia, they wouldn't say, oh yeah, you belong to this place. It wouldn't. So we struggle with these things where, we've all been nomadic at some point in history. We've all done different things. I mean, but someone wants you to belong to somewhere else and they want to claim something for themselves.
Yeah, this is a real basic, this is when you talk about ownership, it's like who gets what and why. Yeah. And ultimately, like every piece of land in America, every piece of land everywhere in the world has a chain of title. I bought it from you, you bought it from someone. But when you trace that chain back, for every piece of land, it goes back to conquest somewhat. And it goes back, in many cases, in much of the world, to a series of conquests and dispossessions and genocides. There's no like natural correct answer to who owns any piece of land or anything in the world. So what we have to do always is think about like what is today? How today do we think about what is the right or just or fair way to balance claims of people who are here today who have very strong claims? Like, I own this land and I got it from so-and-so. It's back in my family. That's really meaningful to me. That's who I am as a person, is attached to this land. So those claims. There's also the claims of the people who were kicked off land and in a totally outrageous and unfair, genocidal, horrific ways at some previous point in history. They don't necessarily have a legal claim, but there are claims for morality and justice by how we sort of make right some of these historical injustices.
Yeah, and then can you even do it? I mean, again, like you look at like a place like the Balkans, the former Yugoslavian state, and then every major empire that we study has gone through there, and so there are you go back 600 years. Well, that's not far enough. You got to go further back. Well, that's not far enough. That's when we were all Greeks.
Yeah.
These things
Yeah.
can be checked because you cannot convince a Croat, a Bosnian, a Serb that they don't own that land that someone else has. There's no fix in that.
Yeah, that's going to be true in every place in the world. You think about North Carolina. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act basically led to the dispossession of the Cherokees who were forced west. It's like there's no place where there's an exception from that. But that doesn't mean what that means is it doesn't mean you throw your hands up. What it means is you say, okay, what I recognize is that possession, one of our 6 basic stories that everyone uses to claim everything, possession plus time equals ownership. But that doesn't mean we don't think about how do we, and there are ways to compensate. Part of them are just like, sometimes people just want an apology. Like apologies are actually pretty powerful and pretty cheap. Like we're really sorry what we did to your people. Sometimes it's an apology and you combine it with like, here's some, training or money or loans or, there's ways to basically add on to an apology. There's lots of ways. It isn't like an on-off switch where it's either mine or it's yours. It can be like, we can figure out ways to have people who are currently there, in many cases, maintain their ties and have some sort of justice for people who we think were unfairly kicked off. It can be both. That's one of the miracles of ownership is that it can be that there isn't like a single on-off switch, like a light switch version of it. You can actually do like a dimmer and so set it at the right level to protect people who are here today and to respect claims of people who were there before.
It is such a. I love that you guys wrote this book. It's so. I've been I got it just the other day, so I haven't been able to crush you the whole thing, but I've just been in it and like going, I love it. It's so good. Everybody should get it. It's called Mine. The link is there on the board. By the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe, hit the reminder bell. That's how you help. Or just go to breakitdownshow.com, click the PayPal button, and just put a little bit of money in the pot. That will help us keep going. Okay, enough about that stuff. I wanted to also. I think I'm right on this. Now, you're the lawyer who studies this kind of thing, but isn't that when Andrew Jackson the case went to the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court said that's Indian lands, and then this is where the meek shall not inherit the earth. Andy Jackson's like, whatever.
Yeah, no, that's right. So if you think about early American history, it was a series of dispossessions and conquests and purchases from native tribes. Actually, what sometimes happened is sometimes you would have the only people who could get to court, at the time were white men. So you'd have 2 white guys suing each other, one of whom had bought the property from the state, Ohio, Illinois, and one of them had bought property from a native tribe. And they both said, "Listen, this property is mine. We both have title." And then the courts have to figure out like which of these old dudes actually wins. And what the court said is they used another one of our 6 basic stories. They said that first in time wins. They said, "Well, hold on, aren't the Native Americans first?" And when the court said no, and then what's so cool about the story was terrible for the Native Americans, terrible. But what was interesting from like today's standpoint is that the courts had to figure out like what counts as first. And it's not like kids lining up in a playground. First is always up for grabs, like how you define first. And the way the court said it is the first to chop down trees, the first to do rural agriculture, like the first to basically make New England look like Old England. They're the first in title. So they simply defined first to favor settlers and disfavor natives. But that's not like some weird law thing. That's like true everywhere, all the time, for everything about ownership. It's always a storytelling battle. And whichever story persuades whoever gets to be the decision maker, that's who wins. So what it means partly for you guys as listeners is you got to know what these stories are, because the same things that were happening with the natives way back when is like you lining up for the COVID shot today. It's like all those issues are the same basic stories, and they're all up for grabs today, the same way they were up for grabs way back when.
We've had some historians on the show that talk about early American history, because as soon as we think we've got our hands on it, we find out that we're way older than 10,000 years. We have to explain why there's Micronesian DNA all throughout the Brazil basin. We know now that people were here. Every time you think you've got it down, ownership goes further back and further back. Yeah. And then so you talk about cutting trees, and even that's problematic. How does an Indian dude come down like, yeah, we were, burning, clearing to make prairie. Yeah. Let that grow to forest. Go over here, burn, make prairie, and rotating. I mean, absolutely terraforming in a modern sense.
100%. Yeah. So the early American courts did not really. They had this image of Native Americans stepping lightly through the land and said that doesn't count as ownership. But Native Americans were farming and shifting the land around, burning things.
Yeah.
they had agriculture. It was a much different, the sort of anthropological image. It was what Native Americans lived like was just wrong.
Yeah.
But it was too late for the Native Americans.
Do you know about this terra preta stuff in the Amazon basin, where over time they just continue to take like fish heads and lightly smolder it, and it's this uber powerful self rejuvenating soil that is fantastically for and so
amazing.
And they can't figure out how to replicate it. It just is there, and it's for sure man-made.
How do you do that? Actually, another challenge for the Amazon is like, how do you do that and keep enough trees standing in the Amazon so we don't all of us fry as a planet? That's a real challenge. That's a real ownership challenge. And it's actually one where the same attachment story, the same button that you use on the airplane seat, it's the same exact story for protecting trees in the Amazon. Basically treating forest dwellers who aren't owners as if they own the trees standing, providing the services for us to be able to breathe. So one of the sort of big advances in environmental protection in the last generation has been thinking about how to create more ownership, more as if ownership for people in forests, so they don't cut the trees all down.
Yeah, we've had Dr. Stephen running won the Nobel Peace Prize when Al Gore and everybody else won. And one of the things he talks about is no nation is really willing to surrender their sovereignty when it comes to the environment. So it belongs to all of us, but none of us want to surrender control of our ownership to an overseeing body to get us all going in the one direction. So US's carbon emissions have dropped and dropped and dropped. However, China and India have a exploding middle class and upper class, and they need access to carbon-based things. And it's an impossible problem.
Politics might not solve climate change, but ownership can. Like, basically creating markets so it's worth more to have trees standing than chopped down. That's more powerful than politics. Like, you can tell people like it's bad for the planet, not to chop it down. It's bad for the planet if you fill in your wetlands. Yeah, but if you're like a farmer and you got nothing else besides this land, and that wetland you can farm it, you're not gonna leave it as a wetland unless someone says, listen, actually we're gonna treat the water filtering services that your wetland provides. We're gonna treat that as if you own the clean water that comes off it, or the air, the clean air. If there's a way to pay you for that, if you own those eco services that your land provides, then suddenly it becomes worth more not to chop the tree down. And that's actually it works. Like, that's how. Like, when you buy carbon, when you fly around, some of your listeners may like buy carbon offsets. Like they feel bad about flying around and say, I'm gonna like try to offset that somehow. What the offset does is pay those people not to chop down trees, as if they owned those services that the trees provide. So ownership actually is what creates the possibility of solving climate change.
You have to do that in a way that culturally works too. Let me just talk for a minute here, but when we look at the map, the overhead shot of Haiti, Hispaniola, right? Haiti and Dominican Republic, the Haiti side, it's a desert. There's no trees, and you're not going to be able to reliably put stuff in the ground because the people there are desperate for resources. They just don't have enough. They're not going to have enough. And whenever we get involved, it seems to get worse because we don't do this in a culturally smart way. Simultaneously, I was in a foreign country. I can't be too specific because some of this could be classified still, but there was an aquifer under the land that we were working on, and we weren't allowed to tell the local people who, lived above this aquifer that this resource was there, because it would cause a weight to the balance of what was going on in the area that we couldn't reliably do. So part of me gets it because you don't want to like cause more problems, but part of me doesn't get it because it's not ours. It's like it's theirs and they should know about it. So we have this balance of trying to get these troubled places going forward, but we deny them ownership of something that's clearly theirs, or we can't sort out how to convince them that these trees are theirs and they're good, and then they're going to be able to get by with other resources because of cultural paths that they have.
Yeah, so like, but we started that with, which is the difference between the Haiti and Dominican Republic side of the island. They're both the two countries on one island. It looks so different. Like, that's like, it's not like nature that does that. And it's not even culture that does that. I mean, what it is really different rules about how ownership works. So in Haiti, there really hasn't been. I actually worked on Haiti for a while on planting neem trees, a very fast-growing tree. In order to, a lot of the trees in Haiti are chopped down to make charcoal. It's like if you're very poor, charcoal is how you cook your dinner. So the question was like, is there a way to like reforest Haiti using very fast-growing Indian trees called neem trees. So that's a sort of a technical solution. But as much as you have like agricultural engineering like that, that was an earlier stage in my career. I think the real solutions today, if I were work in Haiti today, wouldn't be agricultural engineering solutions. They would be ownership engineering solutions. That we think about, agricultural engineering, rocket engineering, but ownership engineering is actually even more powerful. It's how we get through our day all day long, but it also gives you the kind of tools that you need to sort of think, if you're a poor Haitian and you need to feed your family dinner, like what's the right ownership regime for trees that makes you leave the trees intact, actually profit from those, and do something else for your charcoal, or for your, maybe instead of charcoal, you use some other kind of fuel. So it's actually possible using ownership tools to engineer that. You can plant a lot of neem trees, and people will still chop them down. The question is, how do you engineer the ownership around them so people have it worth more standing than chopped down?
Yeah, Bjorn Lomborg talks a lot about this, especially with Haiti. I don't know how much you know about his work, but he talks about the environment. If people are energy poor, they're going to do things that don't benefit the long-term well-being. And this is what we're talking about in Haiti. Sure. And then how do you convince, because I've been to Afghanistan, and you're talking to farmers and you're like, if you use less water, your pomegranates will grow bigger and you'll get more money for them. Well, they're farmers. They don't believe you. They have a system. And so you can't just walk in and change it because they own this land. They work this land themselves. They own their legacy. It's so confusing and hard. But you're right, that ownership piece, if you can crack the code and make, I don't know, using natural gas has been the answer, right? We proposed for Haiti. If you can get them to use that instead of burning not only coal that they make from healthy trees, but burning it in their home so that they're also toxifying themselves from this charcoal that they breathe in. What a mess.
Well, here's the thing. This is, it's true in Afghanistan. It's true in Haiti. The exact same thing they were talking about is true in California, where you're sitting right now. Like the next time you eat a pistachio or a walnut, I guarantee that pistachio or walnut or avocado, it was grown in California's Central Valley. That is the most valuable agricultural area on the planet. And it's basically a desert. The reason it's valuable is because the farmers with those pistachio trees are pumping an unfathomable amount of water up from that aquifer. It's not like the country where you couldn't tell them the aquifer existed. They know it exists. They figured it out. And everyone sticks their straws into the punch bowl, which means that the Central Valley in places has sunk about 30 feet. Because aquifers are like sponges. You suck all the water out. The land compresses down. Roads are buckling. Houses are cracking in the Central Valley. And it's the exact same thing. You tell a pistachio farmer, don't irrigate your crops, and his trees die. He has a 20-year investment in those trees. So it's the exact same problem, and it has the exact same kind of ownership solutions. It turns out that we actually can have agriculture and not destroy the aquifers. Like you just re-engineer how ownership is held to, instead of having unlimited water draws, you basically, what California has done is they create water districts that create management plans which balance the interests of farmers who need the water. There's a lot of military bases out there. Military needs the water. And there's also, Los Angeles, which needs the water. Like, how do you balance all those conflicting sources? If you just do it by everybody puts their straw in, what you get is everybody has an empty punch bowl.
Yeah, no, it's so incredible. You reminded me of so many different shows because this really puts its fingers. We got almost 1,000 shows here, and I could probably do this all day with these shows. But we had Stephen Running on. Again, this guy's an environmentalist, and he said part of our problem is that we have these natural resources, for example, natural gas, and then the oil company comes in to frack, and we don't force them within their contract to capture that gas. We just waste it.
They burn it off. Yeah, they burn it off.
Right. And so they're going to make a lot of money regardless. And if they capture this gas, yes, it's hard to do, but force the innovation to capture these things and use natural resources because they belong to all of us.
For sure.
In theory.
Yeah.
Although I don't have a thing signed saying Pete owns the natural gas.
Oh, I want that. That's what I want to see is Pete owns the natural gas.
Right.
Let's do that.
Yeah. And then you can hold someone accountable. And if that costs more money on the consumer side, then that's part of the cost of gaining access to this thing that we own, because it is hard to capture natural gas.
Well, if you come at this from a sort of a more conservative economic standpoint, what you would say is, listen, the full economic cost of drilling includes both the gas and the oil. And it's an unfair subsidy to the oil provider if they can just burn off the gas. Now, actually, if we're going to have the full economic cost of gas drilling, of oil drilling, that has to include the price of the gas that they're otherwise flaring. That's a pretty easy one to solve. And sometimes the gas and the oil are owned by separate people. That's a little more challenging to sort of unify those interests in the same place. But where they're already unified, it's certainly easy enough to say, hey, listen, part of the price of what you're doing is the cost of the environment, cost of all the rest of us from flaring that stuff. And that's just part of what you price into your product. The same way that you price it into solar or wind. You have the full economic, if you want to basically have a level playing field, you have the full economic cost of that resource as part of the price that the producer sees and that the consumer ultimately chooses. I'm going to choose my energy supplier based on what I think is right for the planet or based on whatever cheapest for me, but there should be a level playing field. And there isn't if they can just flare off the gas.
Are we able to create an ownership for the cost? Like, okay, so we'll use two examples just to kind of cover our bases here.
Yeah.
When we want gold, we have to use horrible chemicals and pollute a river to get it out. But we need gold. Like, it's what we need and we value it so much. But we don't charge that mining company enough money to make them, find better ways to do it or to whatever. We want to pay the lowest cost. Same thing with fuel. Same thing with, we're desperate to put Teslas on the road and have batteries run everything.
Yeah.
However, there's a cost to this, and the thermodynamics aren't very friendly with all these things. So we've got all this waste. We've got to scratch down a mountain in a place that's, like Afghanistan has tons of lithium, in there.
Yeah.
Now you've got to go, get them stabilized enough to make that safe enough that you can put it gets crazy and super expensive and a heavy carbon footprint to accomplish these things. And tearing them down a mountain or digging a giant pit. Yeah,
listen, this is true for, all of history. Like, we burn things, we chop things. It's like we all of our lives depend on a tremendous amount of resource extraction. So the question isn't, are we going to extract resources? It's like, are we going to charge? I think the better question is, are we going to charge the full cost for them? So, when you buy a computer and you use it for 2 years, or a cell phone, use it for 2 years, and then toss it, there's $1 billion, there's billions of these old cell phones lying around, and they're full of heavy chemicals and all kinds of stuff that's very hard to break down. But if you can just dispose of them for free, which you can toss it away, then Apple basically is getting a big subsidy. They're basically imposing a big cost on the planet that they're not charging for. So if it costs $1,000 for a cell phone and it costs $50 to break it down, Apple should be paying those $50 so that they actually, the full life cycle cost of their product should be part of the initial cost. If it isn't, then those costs don't magically disappear if you toss it out.
No,
those costs just get borne by all the rest of us. So it's actually a new trend in environmental sort of engineering, which is basically having the life cycle cost of the product built in up front, so that we all pay. There actually is a level playing field, so we all actually pay the real cost of the stuff that we consume, which we all should do. I'm prepared to pay what it really costs. I don't think I should get subsidized and be able to sort of hurt everybody else, so I get something for a little bit cheaper.
These environmental costs, whether it's the ocean or everything else, and again, this goes everywhere. Like, if we all own the ocean, it's a closed system. Doesn't seem like it when you turn on the water in your faucet.
Yeah.
But if you dump things, like we've had, again, another guy, William Bonk, on, and a bunch of these guys to talk about the chemicals that we use in weapons. Like, any weapons dumped into the ocean before 1972 legally do not exist.
Which is shocking, because they in practice exist. And one of the points that you're making there is there's a huge gap between what we know to be ownership and we know to exist and like the law.
Yeah.
The law is like a really imperfect mechanism for sorting out all of these conflicts. And in your daily life, like, you lose a wallet or you find a wallet or you get in line, those are all ownership conflicts, and they're not being sorted out through law. They're like the whole other set of mechanisms for how we solve really big problems from the environment, but also just in our daily lives.
We struggle with ownership in a lot of areas because it is hard to define. You have the, I would call it like the three-legged stool of abortion, right? And we're talking about bodies. It's one of the chapters in there.
Yeah, for sure.
You have a baby.
Yeah.
You have, and again, I saw this great meme, and this is why memes and political cartoons are great. Any kind of organism on Mars is life, but a baby is not. So we have this struggle, and I'm not making a statement either way. It's just that teetering thing.
Yeah.
The capability of a dad to say yes or no to being a father. I don't want that kid. Legally, don't necessarily get to say that. And then, of course, the government compelling a woman to have a baby. like, oh my God. So how do you balance this three-legged problem? You have to deny someone some kind of moral right, some ownership, I think. But maybe you're the lawyer.
No,
Tell me.
listen, this is, the area that we moved into now is an area where there is law, but, where every one of your listeners has a strong personal, maybe religious, maybe ethical set of viewpoints. And it's like, that's the terrain actually on which we really need to be having the discussion. It's not really ultimately, the law there simply reflects some set of balances of those conflicting ethical and moral concerns. So one of the ways that we try to think about this, actually, this is a chapter in the book. I think that maybe people who are interested in this question is kind of a useful one. So the chapter is Our Bodies, Ourselves. And we think, chapter 5. So it's actually, we think of ownership, self-ownership, one of the 6 basic stories, as like either an on-off switch. Like it's either I own my body, or it used to be like slavery in America. Like the history of property in this country was that other people could own African-American people. Like the history of slavery is really deep in American property law. Just in places where you would never expect it. Like, can the NCAA, can college athletes like sell their, endorsements, like in the sports world? Like that's actually the way we discuss that actually is like links straight back to the history of slavery. So areas like today, like what you can do with your body, are all sort of have the echoes of this on-off switch. You either are owned or not owned as a person. So when we have resources that come out of our body, our hair that you can sell, blood, plasma, eggs, sperm, or services from your body, a woman who wants to be a surrogate, or even all the way to abortion or prostitution, services that come out of your body. All of those have this intensely personal on-off sense that we usually use. And one of the points that we try to make is it's better to think about ownership as a dimmer switch, where we can try to address the dignity or the sanctity concerns of, say, the woman or of the father or of the child, without having sort of an on-off, there's only one possible answer. Like, how do we combine the different values that are really at stake here about dignity, about coercion, about what it means to be a human being? All of these things are like go to our absolutely deepest values. And there's no like correct legal answer. It's not the law. It's not the law. It's all about like what we think is the right thing to do for the most important stuff, the most important resource there is, which is ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the dimmer idea, and you also get to move the dimmer switch, as times evolve.
Yeah,
we still are desperate to discuss violently almost Roe v. Wade. We're constantly working this problem, and I wish we could get past it, but this is a dimmer switch that we just can't decide who owns the control on the switch even.
Yeah, one of the things that you have to realize about ownership is that it very much is a choice that we have to keep making. It's not like one and done. Like where we set the choice on abortion, where we set the choice on prostitution, where we set the choice on like, can you sell your kidney? Like there's really strong views for and against being able to sell your organs. And if you say no, you condemn thousands of people to death every year who are on dialysis. If you say yes, you worry like, boy, really poor people just become organ banks for the rich. Like that's not good. So if you only have these two polar extremes, the on and off switch, like what do? You either have, you have basically stuck between two really bad outcomes. But if you're like, if you think about the dimmer, well, maybe there is a way to protect the humanity and dignity of the person who's giving up the kidney and protect the lives of people who are dying unnecessarily from kidney failure. Like we can actually do both, I think.
Along those same lines, as we get better at keeping people alive, like, businessmen don't die at 52 because they've been smoking and drinking and eating terrible food. We live a lot longer. And I saw a number the other day, kids born today are more than 50% likely to live deep into past 100, like 100 to 120.
I saw that too. Isn't that amazing? That's
amazing.
Yeah.
But I've also read Gulliver's Travels, and I didn't just focus on the big and the small. I focused on the world with the immortals. And so when we, as we fix like the heart problem, it doesn't mean we fix the brain problem or anything else. Or, we're working on Alzheimer's. But if I was in a state where my loved ones thought, this isn't what Pete wants. He's been on the record and he said, I'm just nothing but a problem, that's good for me. Send me to the Rainbow Bridge. Yeah. But we struggle with this. And if you don't have money, you can't just fly to Switzerland or go to some place that's, euthanasia friendly.
Yeah.
But at some point, we're going to have to deal with that part of our reality, because getting old isn't, you look at like once you get to 60, the pace of age changes so dramatically and obviously for people.
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. And then one of the challenges for like who gets what and why for the stuff that we have today in our lives is like, how do we think about that in a world where not just each of us individually are getting older, but how do we think about it in a world where like collectively as a society, people are having like really engaged, productive, full, vibrant lives into their 70s, 80s, 90s. My uncle is 101.
Wow.
And he is, so cool. He's like he's super sharp. He's still like, he edits plays that he can then direct to put on stage at the place where he lives. So he has like a cast of characters. He's out there directing. He's
a
like
captive audience.
He's got kind of captive audience. I mean, it's not always the same audience from show to show, but he's like, he is 100% with it and 100% involved. So we have to think about ownership in a world where like right now he's an extraordinary, rare exception, but like in a few decades, he won't be. We'll still have the same 6 ownership stories. Those don't change. Those go back to the Bible, actually way before it. And they go forward, into the future. And they work in Afghanistan and Haiti, and they work here in the California Central Valley. It's the same simple stories. But what we do have to do is think about how do we adjust that for a world where people are living such radically different lives. Like one version of that is like, what can you pass on to your kids in terms of inheritance? Yeah. What do you pass on to your kids in terms of values? Like all of those have an ownership component to them. And like also, like if you say pull the plug on me, like what does it mean for your organs? Maybe they're still useful for somebody who maybe one person who has dies in a fairly healthy way can have organs that can save a half dozen lives. Like organ donation itself is an ownership question. That's a very live question for saving potentially thousands or tens of thousands of lives in this country if you did it in a smarter way.
Yeah. And this is a thing that we're going to have to deal with. And this, well, people may not realize this, but a speech therapist in a retirement center makes the call a lot of times. Like, this is it. No more.
Yeah, for sure.
And this is not a doctor. This is a speech therapist who's like, their body no longer works in a way. And so they own this life and death decision. And again, like once you're there, that's a problem. And the other one is what if you're 98 and you're like, I'm having a bad day. I'm done. I don't want to be around anymore. Give me the pill. And then you take the pill. Or do you like, hey, tomorrow you always do this. Tomorrow you're in a better mood.
Yeah.
And like, how do you guide someone down this path that they're going to inevitably go?
Yeah.
But you don't want it to be like the cooling off period. Like, well, I got to wait 2 weeks to die.
I have a number of hats as a guy who writes about stuff. And this book is about like, super cool, fun stories, like blow your mind, Freakonomics, nudge, kind of that kind of stuff. I have another hat that I wear, which is more sort of, fancy property theory. And one of the things we start to think about a lot is exactly the question that you talk about. Like, what does it mean to make a choice? What does it mean to make a choice?
Right.
And, it's so important that people's choices be fully informed on the one hand, and it's also important that people be free, like to make their own choices. And there's not like a magic answer to that. What there has to be, though, are procedures that make what we call cooling off periods, basically. So people don't make rash or opportunistic decisions about the most important issues in their lives. Like when you get divorced, for example, and there's no way, you can get divorced in this country. If your marriage is coming to an end, you can't lock yourself into it. But you also can't leave overnight. Like in some cultures, you can get divorced. You can say, I divorce you, and they're divorced the next day. But that leads to really opportunistic divorce.
Yeah.
So what we have in this country is a cooling off period. Like you need to do 6 months or some places a year. But that cooling off period is the same issue with like, end of life decisions. Like you want people to have informed decisions, but you also want to protect their autonomy. So how do you get a balance that protects both of those values? And the answer is, you can. You can do it by sort of thinking creatively about what the right process is that protects people's autonomy, but gives us some confidence as a society that some random person isn't pulling the plug on someone you love.
This is, again, I love the way you guys have done this, and the Freakonomics thing is always incredible, and you found this fantastic forum to tell the story. I guess my last question is just, as you did this, what didn't make it in the book, or what's the big revelation where you're like, I never thought about this. This has changed completely how I see things. Either one.
Well, I mean, we had a ruthless audition process for this book. Like each story that was in the book, it had to be like super fun, totally counterintuitive, or absolutely infuriating.
Right.
And we wrote that like, we don't expect lawyers to be reading it. This book is not for lawyers. This book is to like pick up, back few. We actually, the original idea was we wanted this book in airport bookstores. If you like, something, if you don't want like the celebrity magazine, want something fun to read, like that was our challenge to ourselves. It had to be a absolute page turner. I hope it was. But what was most surprising for me is like, and what I learned, I've been teaching property for 25 years. I have had thousands of students. Until I wrote this book, I didn't realize like that there are just these handful of simple stories. Like, you reap what you sow, first come, first serve, the ones that we've talked about. There aren't any others. Like that's it. Like that's self-ownership. Like that's how everyone claims everything in the world. And it's the same simple stories that kids use on the playground and businesses use to move us around. Like what so surprised me is like, I walk around my life and like, I see a line and I say, like, are people being paid to stand in that line? Like, why did the owner set it up that way? Like I see, just outside my window here, I see all these seats and tables on Broadway Avenue. Like, hold on, who really owns that space in front of the restaurant? Like that's city space. It's my space. Can I sit down in the chair or not? Like, if I get a COVID vaccine, is the second vaccine mine? What was so surprising to me was that there's a handful of stories and they control so much more than I realized. Anyway, what I realized also is once you know that, you can do something about it. Like I now have a better sense of like how to like for example, on the airplane story, like the wedge of seat, can you lean back or not, what we started with. Like it turns out that if you pay the guy behind you, if you pay the guy in front of you, you offer him $20 not to recline, that doesn't work so well. If you ask them just don't recline onto me, it doesn't work so well. But about 3/4 of the time, if you just buy them a drink or a snack, like people won't recline onto you. Yeah. If you want to do some work, it turns out that creating some community actually makes a difference. So it turns out that there's really simple ways that you can take back that remote control of ownership to make your life like a better life.
I love it, man. It's such a great book. So again, it's called Mine. It's right here. Oops, it's right here. You guys should definitely get this thing. I'm absolutely enjoying it, recommending it to all of my friends. Let me roll this thing. Thank you so much for coming on. I mean, you've been all over the place talking, and I was watching you live earlier. Hopefully I got you to some different areas, but I want to see one more thing. One more thing. In my hometown, 4th of July parade, you can put your chair or chalk.
Oh, love it. No way. You can draw a chair outline in chalk.
A whole family bought.
Really? On the parade route?
It was getting longer and longer, like longer waiting times, like 2 weeks out. People are like, this is going to be our square, right?
Oh my God, I love it. See, that's such cool stuff.
Yeah, it's so cool. And then it was pushback. And so someone put free chairs ad on Craigslist for downtown Benicia. Yeah, so if you put your chair out there, someone on Craigslist is like, I need some lawn chairs.
This is one of the stories we tell in the book, which is in Boston. If you dig your car out, you put a chair in, it's your space in the space. It's your space, and people know not to mess with the space. Sounds like in Benicia, it's the same thing. It's not snow, but it's the parade. I love it. I love it.
Someone might challenge you on it, and they're from New York. And
yeah, hey, well, listen, that's the real life of ownership. Is drawing that chalk line in the right time.
Stand by. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.